أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على المصطفى محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. In our last lesson regarding Islamic jurisprudence, we mentioned a few verdicts from Sayyid al-Sistani Damadullah regarding prayer and the errors that someone might commit in prayer. We mentioned two verdicts, if you remember, and we focused on number one, if someone adds a part to his prayer, if he performs an action which is considered ziyada, an additional part in his prayer, does this need to be intentional, or could it be done even without intending on it being an additional part? We spoke about that. Secondly, we spoke about what happens if a person adds a full rik'ah or a ruku' or two sajdas of the same rik'ah in salat out of unawareness. So someone out of unawareness, he's, for example, thinking about school as he's praying, or he's thinking about a problem that is taking place in his life, and because he's in that state of unawareness, he adds a full rik'ah to his prayer, or he adds a ruku' in one of the rik'at, or he adds two sajdas in the same rik'ah. So he performs four sajdas in reality in one rik'ah. What happens here? His salat becomes void, it becomes invalid. Yes, as Sayyid mentions, Damadullah, that in the case of ruku' and sajdatain, if someone adds a ruku' or two sajdas of the same rik'ah, then based on mandatory precaution, his salat will be void, his salat will be batil. Actually, it's even possible based on the wording of the fatwa that the ihtiyat al-luzumi goes back to the rik'ah as well. But I'll have to double check on that. Nonetheless, today inshallah we're gonna take a new verdict regarding these errors that are performed in salat. And so Sayyid Damadullah says in verdict 838 in Minhaj al-Salihin volume 1, من نقص جزءا سهوا فإن التفت قبل فوات محله تداركه وما بعده. He says that if a person omits a specific part of salat, and that is done out of unawareness, so he's not omitting part of the salat because he's playing around or he's doing this willfully. No, he went into a state of unawareness, a state of sahu, and because of that, he omitted part of the salat. For example, Rami was performing Salat al-Dhuhr. As he's performing Salat al-Dhuhr, he recited Surah al-Fatiha, and then he forgot to recite another surah after Al-Fatiha. He was in a state of sahu, in a state of unawareness, and so he went straight from Surah Al-Fatiha to ruku'. After saying وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, the man said Allahu Akbar and he went into ruku'. So he omitted what? The second surah after Surah Al-Fatiha. As-Sayyid Damadullah here is talking about this issue. Last week we talked about what? Adding something into the prayer. Adding something into the prayer. Now he's talking about subtracting something from the prayer, omitting something, omitting part of the prayer. So he says, من نقص جزءا سهوا فإن التفت قبل فوات محله تداركه وما بعده. He says when someone omits part of the prayer out of unawareness, if that person realizes what he has done before he goes into before he reaches a specific part in salat where he's unable to perform the part that he omitted, then what he should do is perform that part again and perform all the parts that come after it. وإن كان بعد فوات محله فإن كان ركنا بطلت صلاته وإلا صحت. He says, however, if he reaches a point in the prayer where he's no longer able to go back and perform the part that he omitted and all the parts that come after it, he's no longer able to go back, then here we'd have to see what is the part that was omitted. Was it a rukun, a pillar in the prayer, or not? If it was a rukun, a pillar, then his prayer is void. It's invalid. He has to repeat it. But if the part he omitted was not a rukun, then his prayer is correct. Up until now, the verdict is very vague. So let me explain with examples. Let's go back to Rami. Rami is praying. And he's in the first rak'ah of Salat al-Dhuhr. He recites Surah Al-Fatiha. And then, out of unawareness, he forgets to recite the next surah. As he's about to go into ruku', he's still standing, okay? But he has intended, I'm going to go into ruku', and he realizes that he has not recited a second surah after Al-Fatiha. So what is he supposed to do here? Because he has not entered ruku' yet, because he's still standing, he has not entered what we call the boundaries of ruku'. Then he should recite the second surah after Surah Al-Fatiha. For example, he'll recite Surah Al-Ikhlas. And after he finishes the surah, he goes into ruku' and continues his salat, and continues and completes his salat. His salat in this case will be valid. It will be valid. Whereas, if Rami is praying and he recites Surah Al-Fatiha, and then out of unawareness, he forgets to recite the second surah after Al-Fatiha, and he goes into ruku'. Once he goes into ruku', he enters the boundaries of ruku', he realizes, I have not recited any surah after Al-Fatiha. What is he supposed to do in this case? Is he supposed to go back up, recite the second surah, and then go into ruku'? No. He can't do that anymore. Why? Because he has entered ruku'. He has entered a ruku'. So here, what's going to happen? his salat will be valid, although he missed doing part of the salat, which is reading a full chapter after Surah Al-Fatiha. Why will it be valid? Because when he missed that part of the salat, number one, that part is not a rukun. It's not a pillar. Remember, the pillars are what? Niyyah, the intention. Takbirat al-ihram, the first takbirah, the opening takbirah. Ruku', السجدتين من ركعة واحدة, the two sajdas of one ركعة, of the same ركعة. And القيام, standing up. When in takbirat al-ihram, and standing up before you go into ruku'. Those are what? Al-arkan. Those are the pillars of the prayer. Reading the second surah after Al-Fatiha, reading the surah after Al-Fatiha. Is it wajib? Is it mandatory? Yes, it is. Is it a rukun? Is it a pillar? No, it's not. So, because he missed a part which is not a rukun, and that was out of unawareness, it was not done intentionally, and he entered a rukun, he entered a ruku', then in this case, he continues his prayer, and his prayer will be valid. Yes, it would be good to perform sajdatay sahu after his prayer because of the surah that he missed, based on the verdicts of Sayyid al-Sistani. So, based on a recommended precaution in this case specifically, it would be good to recite, to perform sajdatay sahu after salat. But it's not a must to perform sajdatay sahu in this case specifically. And his prayer will be okay. Now, sometimes the part that you're missing in salat, that you're omitting out of unawareness, is a rukun. This is where things get more interesting. Here, if you get to a point where you're unable to go back and fix the mistake, because you've missed a rukun, your salat becomes invalid. And inshallah, Sayyid Stani will explain this in detail later on, after a few lines or sentences. So stay tuned. For example, Khalid was praying Salat al-Maghrib. He was praying Salat al-Maghrib. He performed Takbirat al-Ihram, recited Surah al-Fatiha and Surah al-Ikhlas, and he forgot ruku'. He was thinking about, an issue between him and his wife, and because of that, it preoccupied him. So instead of going into ruku', what happened? He went straight into sujood. He did the first sajda. He got up from the first sajda, recited istighfar, and he went into the second sajda. So what did he do here? He entered a rukun, and he missed a rukun. He's no longer able to go back to fix the mistake because he has entered a rukun, a new rukun, a new pillar. Because of that, although he omitted ruku' out of unawareness, it's not that he did this unintentionally. Although he omitted ruku' out of unawareness, his salat will still be invalid. Why? Because his salat is missing a pillar, which is the ruku'. And he's unable to go back and fix the mistake. Had he remembered before going into the second sajda, before going into this new rukun, he could have fixed the mistake and could have done the ruku' and then done all of the actions that are required after ruku' to make his salat correct. And so the Sayyid says, فإن كان ركنا بطلت or بطلت صلاته وإلا صحت وعليه قضاؤه بعد الصلاة إذا كان المنسي سجدة واحدة وكذلك إذا كان المنسي تشهدا على الأحوط الأولى كما سيأتي. Now, Sayyid mentions that when someone omits one sajda, not two. Remember, the two sajdas of one rak'ah, of the same rak'ah, they are a pillar. But one sajda on its own, of a specific rak'ah, of any rak'ah, is not a pillar. So if someone omits one sajda from any rak'ah in his prayer, out of unawareness, then even if he reaches a point where he's no longer able to go back and fix the mistake, his prayer will be correct. But at the end of the salat, when he finishes it, he has to perform qada. Qada of what? Of the sajda. The sajda that he missed. So here, Sayyid is notifying us that just as we have qada for a full prayer, for example, you sleep during Fajr and you wake up after sunrise, hence you make up Salat al-Fajr, there's also qada for ajza al-Salat. But not all the ajza, not all the parts. Some parts in prayer have to be made up after the prayer if you miss them. One is the sajda. One sajda from a specific rak'ah. You make it up after the prayer. The second part of salat, which is made up, but it's not mandatory to perform its qada, is التشهد. التشهد. Hence the Sayyid says, he says, إذا كان المنسي سجدة واحدة وعليه قضاؤه بعد الصلاة. He has to make up that part which he missed. إذا كان المنسي سجدة واحدة. If the part he forgot to do was one sajda of one specific rak'ah. One sajda of a specific rak'ah. وكذلك إذا كان المنسي تشهدا على الأحوط الأولى. And the same applies if the part he forgot was a tashahhud. Based on recommended precaution. When he says based on recommended precaution, he's telling you with tashahhud, if you miss a tashahhud out of unawareness, and you get to a point where you're unable to go back and fix the mistake, then it's best to make up the tashahhud after the prayer, but it's not mandatory. Then he says, ويتحقق فوات محل الجزء المنسي بأمور. Realize when we were explaining his verdict, the Sayyid mentioned that a person gets to a point where he's no longer able to go back and fix the mistake. How does that happen? How? What is this point that he's talking about? The Sayyid now will explain, but we will not mention all the details today because the verdict is quite long. So we'll start with some details, and inshallah in the upcoming weeks we'll take more details bi'idhnillah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says that there are several scenarios where a person gets to a point such that he gets to a point in the prayer such that he's unable to go back and fix the mistake. There are several reasons, or if you want to say several deeds that can be done which lead you to that point, the point where you can not go back and fix the mistake. So the first one he mentions, the first deed or the first scenario is الدخول في الركن اللاحق. الدخول في الركن اللاحق. The first deed is what? Entering the upcoming rukn. See, we mentioned there are 5 arkan, right? And if you want, you can make them 6. Because al-qiyam, there are 2 types of qiyam that are rukni, that are pillars. Now, in salat, you're going to perform the arkan, some of the arkan multiple times, like ruku'. In salat al-dhuhr, you have 4 ruku'as. All of these ruku'as are what? Arkan, pillars. In salat al-dhuhr, you have 4 sets of 2 sajdas. Each set of 2 sajdas is a rukun. So those are also 4 arkan, right? You have takbirat al-ihram. That's 1 rukun. So you have multiple arkan that you're performing in salat. And of course, you have in niyyah, the intention, which has to be present from the beginning of the prayer to the end of the prayer. So Sayyid says, when someone enters the new rukun, the upcoming rukun, him entering that rukun makes him unable to go back and fix the mistake. So if you omitted part of the prayer out of unawareness and you've entered a new rukun, because you've entered the new rukun, you cannot go back and fix the mistake. Now he gives examples. كمن نسي قراءة الحمد أو السورة أو بعضا منهما أو الترتيب بينهما والتفت بعد الوصول إلى حد الركوع فإنه يمضي في صلاته. He says if someone forgot Surah Al-Fatiha, alright? He forgot Surah Al-Fatiha. Again, he went into a state of unawareness. He forgot Surah Al-Fatiha and he went into ruku'. Once he went into ruku', he remembered, I did not read Surah Al-Fatiha. In this case, he's not required and actually cannot go back to repeat Surah Al-Fatiha. What he should do is perform the ruku' and all the parts that come after it correctly, and his salat will be valid. It will be good. It will be valid. Yes, at the end of the prayer, it would be better to perform sajdatay as-sahw. The same applies if someone forgets the chapter after Surah Al-Fatiha. Because after Surah Al-Fatiha, we have to read 1 full chapter, such as Surah Al-Ikhlas, or Surah Al-Takathur, or Surah Al-Kawthar, or Surah Al-Asr, etc. He says the same applies if someone forgot part of each of the 2 surahs, part of Surah Al-Fatiha and part of the other surah. For example, again, our friend Khalid was praying Salat al-Maghrib, right? He was in his 2nd rak'ah and he recited Al-Fatiha. He said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Then he became unaware, as in he went into a state of unawareness. He began thinking of something else, and he went straight into Surah Al-Asr. He said, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wal-Asr. Again, he began thinking of family issues, spousal issues, life issues, and so he went into ruku'. Subhana Rabbi al-Azim wa bihamdih. He's saying Subhana Rabbi al-Azim wa bihamdih, and he remembers, I did not recite all of Surah Al-Fatiha, nor did I recite all of Surah Al-Asr. Is his salat valid? Yes. Can he go back and fix the mistake by reciting the whole chapter of Al-Fatiha and the whole chapter of Al-Asr? No. Because he entered what? The upcoming rukun, the new rukun, which was al-ruku'. He says, and the same applies if he mixed both surahs with each other. In better terms, he recited Al-Fatiha after reciting the full chapter he recites usually after Al-Fatiha. So Khalid, again, subhanAllah, we're with Khalid today. Khalid is praying Salat al-Maghrib in his first rak'ah. Okay, he says Allahu Akbar, and then he recites Surah Al-Ikhlas, and then he recites Al-Fatiha. This is wrong, right? Al-Fatiha comes first, and then you recite a full chapter after Al-Fatiha. But this person, out of unawareness, out of sahu, he recited a full chapter, for example, Al-Ikhlas, and then he recited Al-Fatiha, and then he went into ruku'. When he enters ruku', he remembers, what have I done? I recited Al-Fatiha after the short surah, after the other surah, when it should be the other way around. Can he go back to fix the mistake? No. Is his salat valid? Yes. His salat is valid. Then he says, أما إذا التفت قبل الوصول إلى حد الركوع فإنه يرجع ويتدارك الجزء وما بعده على الترتيب. He says, however, if that person realizes the mistake he did before he goes into ruku', before he enters what we call the boundaries of ruku'. What's the boundary of ruku'? To enter ruku', you have to bow down to an extent where the tips of your fingers reach your knees. If you've bowed down to an extent where the tips of your fingers reach your knees, then you have entered ruku'. But if you're still standing, or you have, bent your back to a certain extent, but you have not bent it to the extent where the tips of the fingers reach ruku', reach your knees, then you have not entered the boundaries of ruku'. In that case, you have to go back and fix the mistake. And your salat will be correct. It will be valid. But how do you fix the mistake? You perform the part that you omitted, and then you perform all of the wajib parts that naturally come after it. Here we have a few examples. Ammar was praying. Rahmatullah ala Ammar bin Yasir. I'm not talking about Ammar bin Yasir, of course. Some individual called Ammar. Ammar was praying Salat al-Isha. In Salat al-Isha, in the second rak'ah, he recited Al-Fatiha. And then he was about to go into ruku' out of unawareness, because he was preoccupied with something else. So he went into a state of sahu, unawareness, and he was about to go into ruku'. But as he's standing, he has not even bent his back. He remembered, there's a full chapter that I have not recited after Al-Fatiha. So here, what does he do? Simply, he recites the full chapter, for example, Surah Al-Asr, and then he goes into ruku' and continues his salat. Here, his salat is A-OK. It is correct, valid. All right. Let's give a second example. Again with Ammar. Ammar is performing Salat al-Isha in the second rak'ah. When he begins the second rak'ah, he's standing up. Because he's thinking about school, he's in a state of unawareness, he recites al-Ikhlas. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad, wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. Then he realizes, wait, I have not even recited Al-Fatiha. So now what should he do? He's still standing. He has not even bent his back. So he has not entered the boundaries of ruku'. So what does he do? he has to recite Al-Fatiha. And he recites the full chapter after it. Yes, the part he omitted was what? Al-Fatiha. And he has already recited a full chapter. But normally, or say naturally, when you're praying, you're supposed to recite Al-Fatiha first and then a full chapter after it. And so to fix his mistake, he should recite Al-Fatiha and a full chapter after it, and then he goes into ruku'. And then he completes his salat, and his salat will be valid. His salat will be valid. Also, um, also in this case, because he has added a he has added Surah Al-Ikhlas before Surah Al-Fatiha, then it would be better for him to perform Sajdatay Sahu after the prayer, although it's not wajib. Yalla Hamzi, 1 second, Habibi. 1 second. Let me give a third example, and then we'll listen to Hamza's question. Ammar is praying, Salat al-Isha, and he performs his second rak'ah perfectly. But after the second sajda in the second rak'ah, he forgets tashahhud. Again, out of what? Unawareness. Sahu. He forgets tashahhud. And he stands up and starts with the third rak'ah. As he's doing it tasbihat al-arba'a, or reading Surah Al-Fatiha, he remembers, wait, I did not perform tashahhud in the second rak'ah. What is he supposed to do here? Has he entered a rukun? No. Qira'ah is not a rukun. Right now he's reading. He's reading in Tasbihat al-Arba, he's reciting Tasbihat al-Arba or Surah Al-Fatiha. He has not entered a pillar. The pillar is what? The upcoming pillar is the ruku' of the third rak'ah. And so, he should stop the reading, stop the recitation of Tasbihat or Surah Al-Fatiha, sit down. So he basically breaks the qiyam, he sits down, performs tashahhud, and then he gets back up, and what? He repeats التسبيحات الأربعة or Surah Al-Fatiha, and he completes his salat. That's what he is supposed to do. Now, bear in mind that for sujood al-sahu, there are ahkam, there are a bunch of laws and also interesting details that we need to know in regards to sujood al-sahu. So for now, I'm just going to focus on the prayer, right? And if you want later on, we can look into sujood al-sahu بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. In order to know when exactly should sujood al-sahu be done. Okay? Because I don't want to every once in a while mention sujood al-sahu as we are reading these ahkam. It would be simpler to just focus on these ahkam right now and then mention when is it necessary for a person to do sujood al-sahu and when is it good for him to do it based on recommended precaution. Perhaps after this verdict we can look into that quickly and then come back to these verdicts بإذن الله تعالى. Hamza, you had a question?
Salam, yes, I did.
عليك السلام ورحمة الله.
if Ammar is reading Surah Al-Ikhlas, but he didn't finish Surah Al-Ikhlas, and he realized, no, I should have not been reading that Surah Al-Ikhlas. تمام؟ يقطع سورة الإخلاص ويكملها then repeat سورة الفاتحة.
So he's reading Al-Ikhlas in the second rak'ah, you mean?
Yeah, first, second, المهم إنه he read it before سورة الفاتحة.
Okay.
Right? بس and he realizes in the middle of Surah Al-Ikhlas that he shouldn't be reading Surah Al-Ikhlas. Does he just cut the ayah and then read Surah Al-Fatiha, or does he finish Surah Al-Ikhlas, go read Al-Fatiha?
That's a good question. I have to check.
Okay, no problem.
It's not in my mind. I'll check for it, inshallah.
Inshallah.
inshallah. أحسنت، سؤال جميل، وأنت أجمل. طيب، Ali, you have a question too? Doesn't seem like it. Okay. We're almost done. Oh, let me see if we have enough time to continue. Inshallah. Almost done. Okay. So he said ويتدارك الجزء وما بعده على الترتيب وإن كان المنسي ركنا فإن كان تكبيرة الإحرام بطلت صلاته مطلقا. Now Sayyid tells us what happens if someone omits a rukn. What happens if someone omits a rukn out of unawareness? So he starts with takbirat al-ihram. And he says, if someone forgets takbirat al-ihram, then his prayer is void in all cases. How so? Because takbirat al-ihram is the beginning of the prayer. The prayer is opened, it's begun through takbirat al-ihram. So if someone came, مثلا, a person came and wanted to pray Salat al-Asr. So he did the niyyah. نويت أن أصلي صلاة العصر قربة الله تعالى. By the way, you don't have to pronounce the niyyah. As long as it's in your heart, that's enough. And then he began reciting Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Hold on for a second. Where is Takbirat al-Ihram? He did not perform Takbirat al-Ihram. Right? When he remembers that he did not perform Takbirat al-Ihram, he'll know that he has not even started the Salat. And so he has to do what? To perform Takbirat al-Ihram and then do all of the wajibat, all the mandatory deeds that come after it. So whatever he was doing was not actually Salat. It was not a valid Salat. Hence the Sayyid says that person's prayer is invalid in all cases, mutlaqan. So whether he remembers that he did not perform Takbirat al-Ihram as he was still reciting Surah Al-Fatiha or the surah after it, or he remembers after he goes into ruku', in both cases, his prayer, that specific part, which people might call prayer, salat, is invalid. So he has to do what? He has to get up, rise, and perform Takbirat al-Ihram, and then perform all of the mandatory deeds that come after it. Alright, Sayyidina. Jazakallahu khaira. What if the rukun was not Takbirat al-Ihram? It was a ruku' or two sajdas of the same rik'ah. So he says, وَإِذَا كَانَ رُكُوعًا أو سجدتين من ركعة واحدة على الأحوط لزوما. Sorry. He says, وكذا إذا كان ركوعا أو سجدتين من ركعة واحدة على الأحوط لزوما. He says that the same applies if he forgot الركوع. If he forgot ruku' until he did what? Until he went into the next rukun. Then here, his prayer will be invalid. But if he remembers that he forgot ruku' before he enters the next rukun, then he can go back and fix the mistake. So he'll go back and he'll perform the ruku' the way it's supposed to be performed, and he'll perform all of the actions that come after it. He says, also if someone forgets the two sajdas that are of the same rak'ah up until he enters the next rukun, then in this case his salat will be void based on mandatory precaution. Bear in mind the word mandatory precaution al-ahwat wujuban might also apply based on the wording of the verdict to ruku' as well. It might also apply to ruku'. So then he adds saying فَمَنْ نَسِيَ السجدتين حتى ركع أعاد صلاته ولا يمكنه تداركهما على الأحوط لزوما. He says if someone forgets the two sajdas of the same rak'ah until he goes into the upcoming ruku', he goes into the next pillar, then his salat will be void and he won't be able to go back and fix the mistake. For example, Layla was praying. Now we'll use the example of a lady. Jayyid. We don't want the feminists to come after us. Anyways, Layla is praying Salat al-Isha and she performs everything correctly. However, in the third rak'ah, she performs ruku' and gets up from ruku', and for some reason she does what? She forgets the two sajdas. For example, she goes down and she sits down. She's, for example, thinking of something that preoccupies her. She just sits and then she rises. All right? And she recites التسبيحات الأربع because now she considers herself in the fourth rak'ah. She recites التسبيحات الأربع or Surah Al-Fatiha, and she goes into the ruku' of her fourth rak'ah. Because she went into the ruku' of the fourth rak'ah, what happens here? Her salat is void based on mandatory precaution because she did not even perform one sajda from the third rak'ah. She missed both. Had she missed only one sajda, then her salat would have been correct. Because she enters the next ruku', she enters it without performing the sajda out of unawareness. But because she misses both sajdas, then what happens here? Her salat becomes batil, it becomes invalid. All right? Any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah, 1 second, sorry. Actually, I'll just explain one last sentence and then I'll listen to your questions. بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى. He says وإذا التفت قبل الوصول إلى حد الركوع تداركهما وصحت صلاته. If the person who forgets his 2 sajdas of the same rik'ah remembers that he forgot them before he enters the boundaries of ruku', then he can go back and fix the mistake. He can go back, do the 2 sajdas, and then do all the wajibat that come after them, and his prayer will be valid. So in the case of Layla, when she's in her 3rd rak'ah and she sits down, she gets up, for example, for the 4th rak'ah without performing the 2 sajdas. As she's saying at tasbihat al-arba', she remembers, I did not perform the 2 sajdas of the 3rd rak'ah. So she goes down into the 2 sajdas. She goes down, she does the 2 sajdas, right, one after the other, and then performs all the obligations that come after the 2 sajdas. In that case, her salat is valid. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala al-Mustafa Muhammadin wa alihi al-Tahirin. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Next week, inshallah, we're going to continue the verdict. It's not done yet. There are still more details that Sayyid Sistani mentions. But as I told you, it's quite lengthy. So inshallah, we'll stop here for today. And next week, we'll continue bi-idhnillahi ta'ala.